This is the story of the time I saw an apparition that looked as if it crept right off the silver screen. This encounter happened in the late summer, early fall of 2007. I was in the 4th grade and my family had just moved to the absolute boonies of Mississippi. I was born in Mississippi and still had a lot of family down there, but my father had been stationed in another state for the previous several years. Military. So I guess you could say we were moving back home. My parents were in the market to buy a house, but until they found one, we would be staying with my great aunt and her family. My aunt had a beautiful but slightly run-down 100-and-something-year-old home in the woods on the outskirts of an abominably small town. In order to get to her home, you had to drive down a 1-lane dirt road through the woods. On this particular afternoon, my sisters and my cousin, who was about our age, were playing tag in the front yard of my aunt's home. Now, you need to know a little bit about the layout of this yard. The yard was longer than it was wide. Picture a rectangle with the house on one end and the dirt roadway at the other end of it. If you're looking at the house from the road, the right side of the yard is bordered by muddy soil, thick trees, and bamboo that creates a sort of natural border to the property. On the other side of the yard is a length of tropical leafy bushes about waist-high that run from the front of the porch almost down to the road separating the yard from the driveway, just on the other side of the plants. Near the road in the middle of the yard was a ginormous old oak tree dripping with Spanish moss. Now back to the game. This particular round of tag, I was it. My siblings and cousin were running around the yard and the house, trying to hide behind various things. As I was scanning the yard, I noticed the figure of a girl with long, straight brown hair, peeping her head out from behind the big oak tree. She was wearing a dress that fell below her knees, which was very different from what the rest of us kids were wearing, namely cut-off jean shorts and stained t-shirts. I thought it was odd to see someone there, since I could have sworn that I saw all of the girls run in the opposite direction toward the house, but I figured I would go and check it out anyway. As I made it to the tree, I looked behind the trunk, and there was no one there. I was beyond confused at this point. My 10-year-old brain didn't immediately jump to ghost. It was more along the lines of, who the heck was that? The tree was in the center of the yard, with no other trees or shrubbery within 20 or so yards, so if the girl would have run up from behind the tree, I should have seen her. By that point, I started scanning the yard, and my eyes happened to fall to those tropical bushes that bordered the driveway. Crouching down near the bushes was the same figure of the girl. I remember her squatting near the leaves and peering in my direction when I noticed that she had no face. She was completely absent of any facial features, eyes, lips, and nose. Her face was just a smooth expanse of flesh-colored skin. It looked like something straight out of Silent Hill. I must have looked away, and then she was gone. I have never seen this apparition since. Now, I honest to goodness recall this encounter just as I have described above, but it was also 14 years ago. It's quite possible that my memory has faltered in some aspects, or is exaggerated in others, but this is how I recall it. Either way, it was terrifying. The house my grandparents owned when I was younger had a lady in the basement. At least, that's what I called her. My older sister called her the lady on the landing, because she only ever saw her on the landing to the basement. Either way, basement. I haven't correlated any of my personal stories with my cousins or siblings except my own. My aunt used to live down there, and I haven't dared to ask her about it because she had an experience when she was younger where she was physically lifted out of the bed by her ankles, and because of that, you can't even mention ghosts or paranormal stuff because she covers her ears and walks away. But that's another story for another day. Anyways, my personal stories. I'll try to keep them short and sweet. The first time I can recall seeing her, I was hanging out with my aunt, a different aunt than the one mentioned above. She and her son were in the house while my mom was working and my grandparents were in Hawaii. Now, for some reason she chose to bathe me in the basement bathroom, which was weird because there was another fully functional bathroom with a bathtub on the second floor of the house, as well as the shower in my grandparents' room. My cousin was expecting his friends to come over and play. The doorbell rang, so my aunt ran up to answer it, but had my cousin stay with me. I was about 3 or 4 at the time, he was about 9, just to keep an eye on me. She called him up to go play with his friends, and as soon as he left the bathroom and was halfway up the stairs, the door slammed shut and the lights turned off. Then, all of a sudden, I see this woman literally in the mirror facing me, but it looked like she was getting ready to walk out of it because she was getting closer. I, of course, start screaming. My cousin is on the other side of the door desperately trying to get in. My aunt comes flying down the stairs and couldn't get the door to open either. She kept telling me to unlock it, but I was stuck, frozen in terror. Finally, she gets the door open and sees nothing. She flips the switch on and gets me out of the tub, and nothing else was really said about it. Later that week, I was again with my aunt as my mother was working. I asked if I could sleep in Grandma's bed since they weren't there, and at the time, at my little size, that bed seemed humongous. She called them in Hawaii to ask for their permission, and they said it was fine. So I'm asleep in their bed, and I'm not exactly positive if it was a dream or an actual experience that had taken place. I was in the center of the bed. From there, you could see straight into their bathroom on the right side of the room, and then straight down the hallway into the computer room. Mind you, this is on the second floor now, not the basement. In this maybe dream, the bathroom light flipped on and I could see her again coming out of the mirror. It was like I was locked in place, but I could see down the hall in the computer room my mom sitting at my grandma's computer. I tried to call her, but it came out as a dull whisper. I tried over and over, but the sound just wouldn't come out. The woman actually made it out of the mirror this time, and got just a step out of the bathroom when I was able to get unlocked, and I ran down the hallway into the room where my mother was. Again, I don't think anything was ever actually said about this. Another time, maybe 2 years later, my mom and I were sleeping in the basement bedroom, and the closet doors were those full floor-to-ceiling mirrors. I saw her again, but my mom was within reach, and I woke her up and she saw this woman too, and grabbed me and ran upstairs. I guess a more adequate name for her would be the lady in the mirror, but I've been calling her the lady in the basement for what seems like forever. I know for a fact that the cousin from the first story saw her on a number of occasions. My sister saw her, my brother saw her, and a couple of other cousins when they would visit from out of state. It really only affected us kids. Over the past couple of years, I've asked my mother if she remembers it. My sister, my aunt that would watch me, and then her son and everyone is pretty much on the same page of, this was real. My mother's theory is that she was a family member from the past that just stuck with the family, and she didn't mean to be scary, she just was, because we weren't used to seeing that sort of thing. I asked my grandpa about it last week over text if he recalls me ever saying anything to him about her, and he replied, no, and I'd prefer it if you didn't. Now, here's the kicker. My grandma passed in December of 2018. I had not seen the lady in the basement since that particular house. They moved houses, hell, even moved states, and I never saw her in any of the other houses. Not once. But after my grandma died, I saw her in the house that I was living in that wasn't even close to the original house where I first saw her. Now I'm wondering if my mom's theory on her being a relative that passed and just was attached to us is even true, and that when my grandma passed, she followed her, but made her rounds to say bye? Because right after I saw her at my own house, I called my sister immediately and she freaked out because she had seen her at her house the day before. I haven't seen her since, and I pray I don't see her again. Half of me wants to write a letter to the new owners of that house from my childhood and ask them if they have seen her as well. This happened around the end of November of last year while I was at a late-night party at a mutual friend's house. The night started off fine, with us having a few drinks and talking about the classes that we would be taking next semester. This pretty much went on till around 2 a.m., and by this time I wanted to go home since the party was already dying down and most of my friends had already left and I was practically there alone. Instead of wasting money on an Uber, I decided to walk home since my neighborhood was only a few blocks away, but it was still a decent walk. However, there was a shortcut. There was a secluded dirt road in the neighborhood which led to a stretch of walkway with an irrigation canal for crops, and it happened to lead straight to the backyard of my house. I began making my way to the lonely dirt road, and I started to second-guess my decisions since that stretch of walkway can be pretty shady, especially at night since a few drug dealers and junkies like to hang out there. I mustered up the little courage I had, feeling confident that I'd be able to handle myself if anything ever hit the fan, so I proceeded to walk on the desolate road. The night sky was well lit. The moon illuminated my surroundings enough for me to see my environment pretty clearly. The walk was actually pleasant. The only thing that made it tough to navigate was the overgrown, thorny weeds and mesquite branches that kept scraping against the exposed parts of my skin. As I continued to walk through the brush, I finally got to the clearing that led to the bridge, and to my relief, there didn't seem to be anyone in sight. As I began to cross the bridge, I then picked up a faint scent of lavender mixed with something rancid, like the smell of a good cheese or days-old roadkill. I couldn't even tell where it was coming from, but as soon as I made it to the other side of the bridge, the environment seemed to suddenly shift. It's hard to describe, but there was this heavy pressure that washed over me, like being submerged underwater, coupled with this gut feeling telling me that something about the environment was just off. I pushed the feeling off as a random anxiety attack, since I do get them sometimes, but deep down I knew this was different. To calm my nerves, I stopped walking and did slow breathing and began to count to 10 while clenching and releasing my fist to try and shake off this bad vibe or whatever it was. When I finished my little ritual, I felt a little better and more at ease. I started to walk in the direction of my house until I heard this odd grunting sound come from behind me. I turned around, and I saw a woman with short black hair and a silky white gown crouched down with her back turned away from me. She was just a few feet away, and it was strange because when I crossed the bridge, I didn't see anyone around the area. Did I pass by her without even realizing it? I thought to myself. She was hunched over after all, and I do tend to get caught up in my own little world. At this point, the faint smell from earlier was just overbearing, so much so that it started seeping into my sense of taste. I covered my mouth with the bottom of my t-shirt, trying to shield myself from it, while I yelled out the muffled words, "Hello, ma'am? Do you need any help?" She paid no mind to me as she continued to make that weird grunting sound, and I was creeped out at this point, so I walked away a couple steps and turned to get a better look at her. She then decided to stand up, still with her back turned to me, and muttered the word muerte, which means death in Spanish. Confused, trying to understand what the strange woman had said to me, she then slowly turned to meet my gaze, and all the blood in my body pooled in my gut when I saw her face. It was extremely long, too long for a normal human body to be supporting it. The head of this thing almost resembled that of a horse or a donkey's head, and the eyes. I'll never forget the eyes, as much as I've tried to. They were gaping pits of blackness surrounded by a sea of red. Complete silence fell over the area as I was petrified by what I was witnessing. My brain, a scrambling mess, was trying to make sense of the unnatural abomination that was before me. The creature then decided to let out what I can only describe as a high-pitched scream, like a cross between a pig squealing and a woman's wailing. My fight-or-flight reflex then kicked in, and I started sprinting to my house. I didn't even bother trying to unlock the gate to my fence. I jumped over it with ease. My grandmother saw when I came barging into the house. The words wouldn't even leave my mouth to tell her what I had seen, as the fatigue quickly kicked in after the adrenaline wore off. But afterwards, I described everything to her. With a look of urgency, she then decided to perform a cleansing ritual. The ritual involved rubbing an egg all across my body in 3 circular motions while chanting a special prayer. She then cracked the egg that she was using into a clear glass cup that was half filled with water, and when she did, the egg came out with streams of blood, and the yolk that came out of the egg looked similar to a human pupil, which is a very bad omen for the person who is being cleansed. After seeing this, she laid her hands on my forehead and chanted another prayer for about a minute, and threw the raw yolk out of our house and into the driveway. She didn't bother to say anything to me until the following morning, when she reluctantly told me that what I encountered was an entity that specifically preys on men, kind of like a succubus, and told me that this thing had a very dark and malicious intent, and that I was lucky to have gotten away from it. To this day, I haven't set foot on that stretch of road again. When I was 14, I went camping in the summer with the Girl Guides. We only traveled a few miles away to a place that we had visited a few times for game nights. Each year, our guides would merge with the 2 others in the area for a huge campout that lasted about 5 days. The place we were staying in was rumored to have a ghost in the main house. The story says that it only shows itself to members of the family. We were staying on the large estate near the woods, right away from the house. I had been there quite a lot, and knew the grounds pretty well, which was awesome. I was staying in a tent with the younger girls. They were aged 10 to 13, because I didn't have my own tent like the other older girls. The first night went by smoothly. We built a climbing frame, lit candles in the dark, and pretended that we had landed on an alien planet. It was a silly, fun game. The next morning, me and one of the other girls get up early. Our group job was to collect firewood for breakfast, so we ventured into the woods on our own. We were joking around, grabbing sticks and stuff as we walked along. We ended up at the obstacle course and decided to play on it for a while, even though it was out of bounds. When we were done, we grabbed the firewood and started walking back to camp. The woods, to me, they felt and looked strange. It was as if the place was slightly different. I decided to start trying to scare the girl that I was with, just messing around, trying to spook her because it was funny to me. She got really scared and ran off and left me behind. I wasn't bothered as I slowly walked back. That was when I saw movement to my left, and then again up ahead. As I was about to leave the woods, I saw a man out of the corner of my eye. He was wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, carrying something long. I think it was a shotgun. There was no one there. I just shrugged it off. Stuff like that doesn't bother me. I've seen strangers out in the woods before. Once out of the forest, everything goes back to normal. I looked back and the woods were as they should have been. Not like they were moments ago. I don't know how to explain it. They just seemed newer for a while. Not as wild, I guess. But everything was kind of grainy, misty. Except that there was no mist. So I don't think anything of it. I enjoy the campout, we play games, sing songs, and just have a good time. On the second to last day, we play the game. We landed on the alien planet, and once we had breakfast, we had to go hide in the woods, build a shelter, a fire to make food, and people had to go steal food from the campsite without being seen. I am left in the woods on my own for ages as the other girls go around gathering the food. I built a pretty awesome shelter, but I realized I needed my penknife, which I had left in my tent, so I went to go get it. I get to the tent to find the kids that I was sharing it with, crying their eyes out, terrified. Eventually, I get the story out of them. They had been making their food when a man, wearing a white t-shirt and a cap, had appeared and then vanished in front of them where I had seen him. I assured the kids that it was fine, and that it couldn't hurt them, and they eventually went back into the woods, but they were obviously very shaken. I got the blame for telling them a scary story, but I had only tried to scare that one girl at the very start and hadn't mentioned anything about the man to anyone. That night was the campfire. As it ended, we all ran through the pitch-black woods back to camp, leaving the person looking after us all alone in the forest. She had a light, so it was no big deal. She had to make sure that the fire was out as well. I found out a week after that she had been horrified walking back to camp and refused to go back into the woods again after that. She has refused to camp at that site ever since, but she won't tell us what she saw. The last day, I got bored while packing everything up. After all that had happened, I was in a ghost hunting mood, so me and 2 of the other girls go into the trees. I'm in the lead, and I'm walking along a path. I stopped and heard footsteps in front of us. Clear footsteps, walking on dead leaves, but no one was there. No one was anywhere near us. I followed the sounds along a path. Someone had heavy boots on. It was so bizarre. We all had trainers on. The girls I was with were silent. They could hear it as well. I followed the sounds around to a clearing at the very edge of the woods, where it stopped. I decided to sit down in the grass. The others followed me, but they sat behind me because they were scared at this point. I do the whole, "If anyone is there, could you give me a sign?" routine. As I finished, a white mist suddenly fell over the woods. You could see things moving behind it, though nothing was clear. It hung in the air as the other 2 girls ran off screaming. I sat for a minute and watched before saying thank you. As I said this, it was as if a gust of wind hit, and it disappeared. There was no wind. It was just amazing. That was the last of the strange stuff for that camping trip. We had to finish packing up and left the camp that afternoon. I've been back a few times since, and nothing else strange has happened. The woods have always felt normal. A few years after that, I found out that I'm actually related to the family who owned the house and estate. I'm always curious if the activity picked up because I was staying on the grounds. A number of years ago, my mother and I were visiting my aunt in Idaho, staying in her odd house. She had always told us it was haunted, but I never really believed her because to her, everything was haunted. Well, one night during our stay, my mom woke up hearing a baby cry. My cousin Julie, her husband Matt, 10-year-old son Joe, and her daughter Cindy, who was just a few months old, were living with her at the time. My mom assumed that it was their infant daughter and asked my cousin about the crying in the middle of the night, saying something like, "I don't assume you got much sleep." Julie responded by telling her that the noise that she had heard had not been Cindy. But I had heard it right outside my door as well. She then said it must have been her son playing some sort of prank, to which Joe quickly rebutted her by saying that it was not him. Joe also said that he wasn't going back to that part of the house at night. We believed Joe, as his mother and my cousin had experienced things back there several times. He's now an adult and married, and still maintains his innocence, as well as refusing to ever stay in that house alone. Fast forward to last summer. I took a few days vacation and flew up to join my mom and see the family. One night, my aunt, mom, myself, and Joe's wife were sitting at the bar that separates her kitchen from the living room. All of a sudden, in the back of the house, we heard the sound of a door closing. I looked up to see if anyone else had heard it. They had. We got up to investigate the sound, thinking that someone else was in the house. There was not a soul to be found. Then we began to investigate what could have caused it. It sounded like a heavy metal door. We came to the conclusion that it could have been someone hit the loose bathroom door handle. The bathroom was in my line of sight, with no one else in the house at the time. The place just feels weird. It always has. There are many more stories in that house that I've heard about, but I know that I won't do them justice. So I don't know how many people really believe in ghosts or the paranormal, or in people who say that they can see them. I would never say that I'm some professional psychic or medium. I'm not. I just know that I've always been able to see things that other people couldn't, hear things other people couldn't, and knew things that other people didn't. Pretty much my whole life. I felt like a freak and a weirdo for a long time until I just realized this is happening and it isn't going away, so I needed to accept it. I got help from professional mediums and the woo-woo community, and it helped. Backstory, but important. I was laying in bed in my room a couple years ago, trying to fall asleep. It was a long hallway, and my sister's room was at the end, and so was my mom's. My sister had a friend over who was dealing with an abusive boyfriend, and they were drinking and talking about it. This will also be important. You know how you get that feeling that someone's watching you? Or that feeling in a store when you just know that someone has stepped into your space? You don't have to look, you just know. That's what I felt. I looked up, and there's some girl with just her head poked into my room sideways. I just saw her head sideways leaning past my door frame. She looked shorter, maybe 20s, with long black hair, kind of like the girl from The Ring. I'm looking at her wondering what she wanted, and she started to smile. Slowly, her eyes got huge and black, and her jaw unhinged into this giant, sick, pitch black grin. Ice cold slammed into the pit of my stomach as I just stared at her for what felt like hours, frozen in fear before what I'd been taught kicked in and I made her leave. She instantly turned back to normal and skipped off down my hallway toward my sister's room. I thought, oh, is it my sister's friend? Depression and abuse and all those bad situations can really attract those types of beings, so I didn't think anything of it. Fast forward to literally last night. It's been years. My parents got divorced, which is a whole other post of creepy shit. I realized it wasn't just my dad who was the narcissist. It's absolutely my mom, too. They were a toxic pair, and currently, I'm in a situation where I have to live with my mom. It's fine, it's free. I'll be grateful and deal with it. Last night, I'm laying in my bed watching TV, minding my own business. Suddenly, I feel that feeling again. It's always the same feeling regardless of what type of ghosty it is. For me, anyways. I look at my door, and it's the exact same girl. I asked her what she was doing here, and she didn't respond. She just started smiling. Only this time her eyes went white, and her mouth grew into the same huge black grin, but she had tons of teeth like a shark. I get up to get my incense, which drives them out, and she runs in the direction of my mom's room. I go out into the hallway to look in that direction, and I see through my mom's cracked door this weird demon girl literally sitting crouched on top of my mom, staring at me. Almost like she was an animal claiming her prey. It was wild. I've never ever seen anything like that before. I also realized that this girl was never with my sister's friend. She was with my mom for however many years. But my mom's a crazy and very, very negative person regardless of what anyone does to help her. She loves drama and loves being a victim and loves complaining, so it's matching her energy, I guess. This ghost girl feels more like a bully than anything truly demonic. Like she had fun picking on people, which my mom absolutely does too. This ghost girl can't hurt me, she's just around, and man, it sure is scary when she is. She looks like an absolute demon, that's for sure. I've since seen other types of entities in her room at night while she slept, and have told her about it. She says I'm crazy at first, and then in the days that follow, she'll tell me how it feels dark. This happened to me a while back when I decided to go on another camping trip alone. I always liked camping alone. There's something serene and sobering about being isolated in the middle of the wilderness, and I always found it relaxing. So I planned out what trail that I was going to take, packed my camping gear and my rifle for protection, and jumped in my truck. I get to this trail early in the morning and hike about 15 to 20 miles in until I find the right spot and head off the trail to find a place to set up my tent. I stumble upon this nice-sized clearing and decide that it's a nice, beautiful spot to settle down. I'm exhausted at this point, but set up the tent at the southernmost edge of the clearing next to the tree line and manage to get a fire going. I roast some weenies and start to hear a sound in the distance underneath all the forest noise. It sounded like an animal, most likely a deer with a lame leg, as it sounded like the animal was making a walking, kind of dragging noise. I felt bad for the poor guy, but it was too far away and it was getting dark, so I couldn't really go find it and put it out of its misery. I think nothing of it after that, and go about eating my food. After I eat, I douse the fire and crawl into my tent and insert myself into my sleeping bag. I decide that even in my exhausted and relaxed state, I can't go to sleep, so I pull out a book that I brought with me and start to read by the light of my lamp. Hours go by and I hear the sound again, this time closer, right at the opposite side of the clearing. Surprised, I put my book down and listen to this animal walk/drag across the clearing toward my tent. It was really loud at this point, and now it sounds as if the hooves are being really heavily planted, with the dragging noise following seconds after, like the deer is dragging something along behind it. It makes it to about what I assume is the middle of the clearing and stops, and I hear nothing. No breathing. I mean, not a sound from this animal. I unzip the tent and look into the clearing. Nothing but trees and darkness. What on earth? Unnerved at this point, I zip the tent back up and sit there listening for other noises. There was just crickets and the breeze. I decide that there are a lot of strange noises in the woods, and I tried to not let it bother me. Besides, I did have my rifle. I start to doze off when I hear men's laughter off in the distance to my right, followed by women's laughter and sticks snapping off to my left. I'm up now, wondering if what I'm hearing is really what I'm hearing or just a product of being half asleep. Then I hear more faint laughing from a couple other different directions, all sounding like different people, and confirm that this is real. The noises are closing in, and I grab my rifle, preparing to fire off a warning shot into the air in case they come too close. Something about this laughter, how far in the woods that I was, the noise earlier, and the time of night, told me that this was not just another family strolling through. I was on edge enough already, but then I noticed that the nightlife was dead quiet. Not even the wind was making any noise. I decided enough was enough. I unzipped the tent and fired a shot into the night. I sat there and surveyed the tree line, seeing nothing. I listened intently to my surroundings. There was no more laughing, and the forest sounds had returned. I relaxed just a bit, and figuring that I had scared whoever off, I sat down, and in my exhausted state, I fell asleep. I woke up later in a cold sweat, racked with anxiety, and it was still dark outside. I immediately hear two people whispering, not very far from my tent. Alert, I grab my rifle again and listen to what they were saying. I can't make out much, but I hear something about being lost, so I shout, "Hey, who's there?" The voices fall silent. I call out again, "Are you guys lost? Who's there?" Suddenly a huge burst of flame, like a flamethrower, erupted from the middle of the clearing, illuminating several silhouettes of people that were just standing around. In shock, I fire my rifle, blowing a hole in the front of my tent, and it goes dark. Without checking my surroundings, I get up and sprint out of my tent, making a hard left back to where the trail was. I hiked until sunrise, back to my truck with my head over my shoulder the entire way. I never heard anyone follow me. I never saw anyone or anything the entire time, but couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. After that, my enjoyment of camping alone left me. I left all my gear in the woods that night. My brother and I were staying out at night at our grandparents' house, and now for context, her house is in the middle of the ghetto in Golf Manor. Anyway, me and my brother were watching TV and my grandma was at the store, and then suddenly my brother says, "Want to go into the basement?" Not trying to sound like a wuss, I agreed. This was the worst decision of the month. We go into the basement, and it is creepy as hell, and when we reach the bottom of the staircase, the door shuts behind us. Now, I just shake it off as natural, but still, I feel uneasy. We go into the garage because her garage is in the basement, so we start going through. We find a rusty pipe and a motorcycle handlebar and some faint writing on the wall. We obviously find other things like a lawnmower and lawn stuff too. But then, we heard a loud bang, like the sound of a metal door slamming. It was the laundry room door. We almost crapped our pants, and we ran back upstairs, scared as hell. Later that night, we started to fall asleep. Grandma was already asleep. We heard what sounded like all the basement doors opening and slamming shut. Grandma, like I said, was not awake. We ended up finally falling asleep and told her about what happened the next morning. She just laughed and said, "That's just Jim messing with you." And then she explained that Jim was the old house owner who had died there. That didn't really help us much, but it did ease our minds. I was born a twin, but my twin sister died at birth. So did all 6 children my parents had after me. Those died pretty early into the pregnancy, so it was mostly miscarriages. My twin was the only one who took a few breaths before passing. I'm the only one who survived and grew up to be the adult I am today. I only lived in one house during my entire lifetime, until recently when I got to finally move out. There's good reason for that. I learned about my siblings, especially my twin sister, when I was 14 years old. But when I was a first grader, I would wholeheartedly believe that I wasn't an only child, and tell my teachers and the other children about my sister who I was playing with and sharing a room with. By the way, I don't have actual memories of this because no one was there. But I didn't lie for attention. I genuinely believed that. I had a fair share of trauma and mental illnesses in my life already, so when I started to hallucinate disfigured shadows and children in my house at age 12, I went to see a therapist, and it was deemed a symptom of my PTSD. The shadows would form a kind of uncanny young girl's shape most of the time. Until recently, I just discovered these hallucinations were side effects of my admittedly fragile mental state, since the encounters really scared me. Sometimes it even felt like it would talk to me in a weird, unfriendly way. They stopped at the age of 14, when my mother finally told me about my siblings. But still on the staircase to my room and around the dinner table where those things appeared, I would feel watched or even chased, especially at night. Sometimes when I'm awake late, I hear footsteps up the stairs to my room, but they just stop in front of the last step and don't go back down, but seem to start from the bottom again a few minutes later. This changed when I got together with my boyfriend. He started sleeping over and spending more time at the house naturally, and I never told him about my scary encounters. So when we were still up at night and the footsteps occurred, which I had learned to ignore quite well, he looked up from his phone screen, clearly alerted, and my stomach dropped. He's a skeptic, so after he mentioned how the sounds were weird, he quickly got his mind off of it. A few weeks later, my boyfriend went to the bathroom at night. In the morning, he told me how weird he felt walking up the stairs. He felt like someone was watching or chasing him. I never told him about how I always felt this exact thing when I walk up those stairs. Those occurrences with him started piling up, until I got genuinely terrified of staying longer than necessary in that godforsaken house. Right after I turned 18 earlier this year, I started working my hardest to afford to move out. And I finally did it last week. So far, I haven't had scary encounters in my new home. Something is telling me that it was her the whole time. Since I was a child, she's been tormenting me. The way my skeptic boyfriend experienced it, the same exact way without knowing, convinced me. I am not crazy. It all started when I was 5 or 6 years old and had an imaginary friend called Bombo. He was a small Victorian boy who lived with his mother, who I said lived under the floorboards, in the house that I grew up in. I used to talk and play with him all the time, teaching him about things like my Velcro shoes and some of the toys that I had. It was no secret to my family who Bombo was, and even what he looked like, or at least from how I had described him. One day my sister, who was 14 years old at the time, went back upstairs to our shared room after a family day out, and saw him standing in the corner of the room staring at her. He was exactly how I had described him, even down to the detail of his clothes. A few years passed, and I was now 10 or 11 years old. Our family had moved house a couple of times, and now lived in a 3-story house in a village just outside my hometown. I always had a weird feeling about that house from the moment we moved in, but didn't think much of it over the excitement of having my own room on the top floor that had a skylight. After a few months, things started to get strange. My things would disappear, I would hear footsteps on the middle floor landing at night, etc. These experiences progressively ended up getting stranger, with sounds like nails being dragged up the railings on the top floor getting worse and worse, as well as some nights my little sister, who was 3 at the time, screaming, saying that there was a man growling at her in her room, although my family put that down to an overactive imagination and didn't really think anything else of it. It was quiet for a couple of months, before everything came back again. This time, it was much worse. This was the first time I saw it. One night I was in my room watching TV and getting things ready for school the next day. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a face peering in at me through my skylight. Its skin was dark, and its eyes were white with no pupils, only veins, dark circles around its eyes leading to black cracks across its face. It was grinning at me, and even without pupils, I knew that it had its eyes locked on me. Needless to say that after a few seconds of initial shock, I ran downstairs to the rest of my family and refused to go back into my room. Shortly after this, my older sister, who had given birth recently and was living with us temporarily, had her own experience. As she was sleeping one night, she heard a knock on her door between 2 and 3 a.m. Thinking I was the one knocking, she shouted, "What?" twice, with no response. The door flung open after a few seconds with such force that the dresser had dented the door from the impact. No one was there. Shortly afterwards, we moved again for personal reasons to the house that we have now been in for years. For years, there was no unusual experiences other than the occasional sound of footsteps, nothing that could be logically explained. When I was 18, my sleep schedule was the same as any teenager, waking up around noon and going to bed around 3 to 4 a.m. This one night in particular, I was up doing the same as always, listening to music, watching films, etc. At midnight, I went downstairs to the kitchen as usual to get some snacks. On my way back out of the kitchen, I saw it again. It was standing behind the front door looking in through one of the glass panels. It was the same face that I saw all those years ago. Same skin, same eyes, same dark circles and cracking features. It was staring right at me, this time with one of its hands leaning on the other glass panel as it watched me. The only difference was that this time it wasn't grinning. After standing there for what felt like an eternity, I ran as fast as I could up to my room and locked myself inside. I didn't sleep a wink that night. Some family friends who were regular churchgoers theorized after they heard what I saw that this thing that I saw was Bombo, or what had taken the form of him in the first place, and that when I had stopped giving him my attention and energy, he had then tried to use another way of getting my attention. I don't know what to think for sure. All I know is that what I saw was the exact same thing that I saw as a child, and it came back. It's been 4 years since the last time I saw it, and I hope I never see it again. I live in the basement of my parents-in-law's house, and my wife never goes down to my room. I'm almost always in there alone. Since I've lived there, a few things have been happening that I dismissed as ventilation or something or other, such as my door slowly creeping open. Frankly, I wouldn't even have noticed something opening if it weren't for the green indicator light of something I have plugged into the wall outside my room. At night, if I have to leave my room, I exit and make an immediate left and dip into the bathroom. I can almost always sense an entity in the living area or bar area of the basement. This feeling is compounded when I exit the bathroom and my reflection appears on the wall of our sliding doors. Sometimes, I do not have a face in my reflection. I quickly re-enter my bedroom and shut and lock the door. Some nights there's a knocking from within my mattress that wakes me up, usually between 3 and 3:15 a.m. I have no way of dealing with this other than risking it and fleeing upstairs to my son's room. My son, 3, has autism and frequently says, "That's scary," over and over in the basement while looking toward the bathroom and living areas. The light switches that I have access to when leaving the room frequently cease to function right when I need them, or will flicker out almost violently as I'm on the staircase halfway up and out of the basement. I can hear rustling in the middle of the night sometimes as well, and I occasionally convince myself that it's just a mouse. Lately, this has graduated to the sound of footsteps in the ceiling in the middle of the night. Most recently, when I heard these footsteps, there was no one home but me, and I searched the house wielding a knife for an intruder to find no one home. I think that this entity is aware that I know it exists, and I interacted with it via the mirror once, and it contorted my face. This happened to me when I was a teenager. I think it was in the spring of 1998 when I was 14. My Boy Scout troop went camping in the Ozark Mountains in Arkansas. I grew up in a very small town in Tennessee, and the boys in my troop were people that I'd known my whole life, and we were all very close and knew each other very well and trusted one another. We had been hiking for 5 days or so, and it was miserable. It rained every day, and we were all exhausted and sore and hungry and covered with blisters. The adults realized that we had bitten off more than we could chew in trying to hike a 60-mile trail, especially with the awful weather, so we had changed course and gotten off the trail to spend the night in a drive-in campground. It was the kind of place with hookups for RVs, picnic tables, it had fire pits and grills, and a central bathhouse with showers and toilets. It was in a very remote area, far from a town or another house. There may have been a few other small groups, but if there were, we never interacted with or saw any of them. We were all filthy and wet, and thus very excited about taking a hot shower. It was dark, and we had finished dinner. A group of 5 of my friends, including my friend Jeremy, who, like everyone else in our group, I had known since we were babies, headed up to the bathhouse, which was maybe a quarter-mile walk through the pitch-dark woods up a worn-down gravel walking trail. I stayed behind to clean up, and after 10 or 15 minutes, followed them by myself. I had a weak little flashlight, the old incandescent kind, pre-LED. When I got about halfway to the bathhouse, I could see the light from it off in the distance through the woods. I heard a noise to my left, and I looked over and saw my friend Jeremy standing by an old-school manual water pump about 20 feet away off the trail. There was a strange light around him, like the moon had come out from behind the clouds. I was startled to see him there by himself in the woods. I asked him if he was already done with his shower. He seemed kind of sad, and he said, "Yeah, it's all yours." I said okay and didn't think much of it until I got to the bathhouse. When I walked in the door, my friends were all in there, and I heard Jeremy talking from in the shower. All the blood drained out of my head, and all the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I had to sit down before I passed out. My friends were really freaked and wanted to know what was wrong. I told them what had happened. They nervously made jokes about how I must have been smoking pot, but this was long before any of us had ever experimented with any mind-altering substance. Regardless, I could tell that they believed me. Like I said, we had known each other forever, and knew when one of us was exaggerating or playing a joke. We all waited together until everyone was finished showering and brushing teeth, and then walked back together in complete silence. When we got to the spot that I had seen, whoever he was gone without a trace. The water pump was still there, though. No one had noticed it before, because it was a ways off the trail and obviously not in use. We got back to our campsite and went to bed really scared. I remember not sleeping much that night. In all the years since then, I've never been able to figure out what occurred. Was there a random teenage boy in the woods who looked just like my friend? Unlikely. Did I hallucinate it? Also unlikely. So who's to say? My friend Ava hasn't lived with her mom in over 2 years since she moved in with her boyfriend. But recently, I went back to her mom's house with her to grab some plants that she had propagated and have lunch. It was a normal day, and I had been in the house many times before, so it wasn't any different. The visit was short, but when they went upstairs to discuss what they should do with her old room, I was left to my own devices on the first floor. The basement didn't have a door to the downstairs, and the dining room was adjacent to it. So naturally, I decided to look down the stairs since it always gave me a spook. I'm not really a huge fan of the paranormal, and I never really had a cut-and-dry experience. I also never, quote-unquote, pick up on vibes either, but I hated the vibe of her mom's place, especially the basement. When I went to the stairs, I looked down them and saw a weird, humanoid figure in the darkness staring back at me. My entire body felt fuzzy, and I couldn't move until I heard Ava and her mom coming back down the stairs, and I hightailed it away from there. Not really sure what it was, but Ava has always said that the house was haunted, and that she avoids the basement like the plague. When I was about 12, I'm now 23, I lived in a relatively large, run-down house. I don't know much about its history, but I do know that it was built in 1936, based off of a newspaper that my family found in one of the walls during a renovation. I believe it had about 17 separate rooms, a fact that I was obsessed with when I first moved in. I just liked counting things. These rooms included 2 basements. One was right near the garage with an old door that went down to a concrete cellar where you could access some of the ducts to the house. And there was one within the house that held the laundry room and a storage room. My bedroom and the bedroom adjacent to mine both had crawl spaces going into the walls, 2 of which I covered with dressers. The house often gave me a sense of unease because of the sounds that it made due to it being old, combined with the fact that we couldn't afford heating it all winter, so there were blankets and plastic wrap in all of the windows, constantly making it very dark. Being alone in it was just scary for some reason. I could never shake the feeling of something looking over my shoulder when I was there alone, especially causing me to act like a fool and yell out at nothing while home alone sometimes. Honestly, I'm not sure what caused that, but I'm sure that it had to do with the level of darkness within the house, due to there being no natural lighting and my tiny adolescent brain conjuring up demons just because the house had been settling or something of that sort. One day, I was heading downstairs to do the laundry, and after I was done switching everything over and grabbing the laundry basket, my attention got caught by a large tank of some sort on one of the outer walls of the laundry room. I'm not sure what it held. It wasn't a water heater, but it may have been some sort of reservoir back in the day. It was very, very dusty, since no one ever went near it or touched it at all. Covering the tank this time were dozens of handprints, small to large, and also ones with much longer fingers than a normal hand. I'm not sure if it was due to dragging down, or the hands were just like that. It sent me into fight or flight immediately. I sprinted up the stairs and stayed up there for the rest of the day. It really bothered me trying to think of what could have caused the unnatural-looking, long-fingered handprints. I scared myself a lot thinking about it. Recently, I moved into a new apartment, and in the garage there are a few black handprints that I don't remember being there when we moved in. This could just be because I never noticed them, but I swear they were never there, and one day recently, they had just appeared. It brought back my memory of my old house and the fingerprints in the dust, hence my post here. It makes me a little uneasy, but not much else can be done about it, I'm sure. This event has stayed with me through the years, and I thought I would share it to see what others outside of my perspective think. I'm not really sure, though I have had many more experiences to do with that house in the following years of my life. This story took place during my childhood when I was about 12 years old. A few days ago I thought about it, and still don't know exactly what it was, and what I should think. It's not the most spectacular story, but anyway. I grew up in an apartment that was pretty outside the city and close to a forest. We had a lot of greenery around, and we were always playing and sometimes also camping outside with friends during the summer. So one night, me and 2 friends decided to build my tent and sleep outside. We were always then staying up really long and telling ghost stories. While we did this, we suddenly heard noises from outside the tent. We were all holding our breath. Then we could hear steps. They came closer and closer, and then the steps even went around our tent before stopping. We got really scared and said, "Whoever you are, go away or we will call the police." It seemed to work because the steps continued and headed away from our tent. After a minute or so, we then tried to be brave and go outside the tent to see who it might have been. Then, when we looked out, we saw a woman, dressed in a long, white gown, walking away in the dark. I still don't know who or what she was, but it continues to give me chills. This is a completely true story. There was one time about 2 or 3 years ago. I was out in the woods camping with my brother, and we had just gotten there around 4 p.m. to set up and all. Once we had settled in, we got a fire going. I told my brother I was going to go get some firewood because we only had enough to get it started. So I went out, and it was around 7 p.m. Then I got really cold all of a sudden, even though the weather was not cold at all. When I got the sudden rush of coldness, I felt a heavy feeling of just pure evil, hatred, and despair. I immediately went back to my brother. He told me it was fine, that it was probably just a strong wind that had given me a chill. But I knew that something was wrong. We sat around the fire, and I just felt like someone or something was watching me. Once again, I started to feel the same feeling of evil, but this time faintly. It slowly started getting worse and worse, almost as if it were growing inside of me. I brushed it off and went back to bed. At around 2:20-ish in the morning, I heard something that sounded like a scream, and it woke me up. I looked around in the tent and got a flashlight. When I turned the light on, I noticed that my arm was bleeding and had been cut open by something in multiple spots. I woke my brother in a panic and told him what had happened. He said he didn't know what I was talking about, and my arm wasn't even cut, even though I was looking right at it and it was obviously slashed open and bleeding. I said, "Are you joking?" And he continued to say that nothing had happened to me and that I was just pranking him. At that moment, I felt a huge amount of pain in my arm, and then I heard the scream again, but it didn't sound like how a human would scream. It was more of a screech, as if there were an animal or some creature in the distance that was in pain. I looked at my brother and asked if he had heard it, and he asked me, "What do you mean, did I hear that? There was nothing." At that point, I was afraid for my life. I was praying that nothing else would happen. But after a few minutes, I heard the scream again. Every time I heard it, I would feel that dread, that evil again, and my arm would start to have a burning sensation. Eventually, all of it stopped, although after that, I wasn't able to sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told my brother that I wanted to leave ASAP. When we went to get into the truck, I could have sworn out of the corner of my eye that I saw something run through the woods. I looked to the right while packing the stuff up, and 4 of the trees had marks like they had been clawed by something. But the thing is that the marks were at least 12 feet up in the trees, maybe higher. I was so tired and scared that I couldn't even think about it anymore. I just got into the truck, and we left. To this day, I still haven't gone camping again. I was raised in a house that had a few spirits in it. My family are all skeptics and would always find a way to explain things. A few experiences, and then I'll get to the main story. 1. Our house had 3 stories, with technically 3 master bathrooms, 1 on each floor. The one on the main floor we used as an office. I would constantly hear someone walking around in the office at night, sinks turning on, toilets flushing, and occasionally taking. My parents would always say that someone was awake and making those noises, and the toilet and water running was just faulty pipes. 2. There would always be a shadow figure that would pace on the top floor. There was a balcony that overlooked the foyer, and I would usually see who I presumed was a lady in a dress, pacing back and forth. My parents just said that it was the shadow of someone outside. We were on a hill, overlooking all of our neighbors. I don't know how they thought this was possible. 3. I hated using the upstairs bathroom, which was my bathroom. I would hear talking and singing from that bathroom. When no one was home and I was in there, someone would bang on the door. One time I was showering and listening to music. I heard the banging sound so loud that it shook the room, and then the locked door swung open, and I heard a scream. My parents said that my brother was pranking me, which is something that he never did. Anyways, on to the main event. My brother is about 10 years older than me. He was the only sibling living at home with me and my parents. He had the master bedroom in the basement. I was never really in the basement except for going to the garage because it was in the basement next to the bedroom. I always remember feeling uneasy down there, though, but I wanted a big room, so when my brother moved out, I begged my parents to let me have his room, and eventually they caved. I moved all my stuff downstairs, painted and everything. I loved it. I was talking to my brother about it one day, and he told me, "Watch out for the little girl who lives down there. She likes to laugh." I was shocked, as obviously he had to be kidding. My whole family besides me never talked about stuff like that. I just kinda giggled and shrugged it off. He was probably just trying to scare me. About a week after I moved into my new room, I had a friend come over. We were just laying on the floor next to the bathroom laughing when she had to go to the bathroom. She closed the door and I was just zoning out when all of a sudden she goes, "That's not funny." I asked her what she was talking about, as I hadn't done anything. She said that she heard someone laughing right outside the door, but I didn't do anything or hear anything. She left freaked out, and I assumed that my brother had put her up to it since she liked him. A few days later, I hear someone in my bedroom while I'm in the shower. I call out thinking it's my mom, but I don't hear a response. I get out, and as I'm putting on my robe, I hear a little girl's giggle, and then, "Are you looking for me?" I freak out. I throw open the door to my room, but no one is there. I checked the garage and ended up setting off the house alarm so no one could have come or gone through the doors without everyone knowing. I run upstairs, and my mom is pissed that I set off the alarm, and I tell her what just happened. She told me my brother had a similar story when we first moved in, but that it was nothing. I called my brother and asked him why he told me to watch out for the little girl. He said that I was the little girl. He was kidding because, quote-unquote, you would always come downstairs and giggle really creepy. I never did anything like that. I told him that, and he got creeped out. I still would occasionally hear the little girl. I never saw her, but she did like to laugh and open the bathroom and closet doors. I named her Sarah. My brother called me up today and asked me about this. He asked me if I was sure that I never tried to scare him by laughing, and I told him no. He got really uncomfortable. I don't think he knows how to handle the fact that our house is haunted. Before my best friends and I were separated, one passed away, the other moved away. We used to ride around doing all of the haunted legend places within reasonable driving distances. Sometimes we would drive for a few hours, but most of them weren't scary other than the adrenaline-filled, hyped-up, "Did you hear or see that?" that would cause us to get spooked. This one was different. Way different. We were just out of high school, probably 20 at the most, and we were looking for an actually scary place to visit. A lot of people we knew that we were into these kinds of things, so we would always get tips on where to go. There was the original 3 of us that day and another friend that wanted to tag along. After a little drive to our destination, about 45 minutes, we stopped at a Wawa to get gas and grab a few snacks. Like I stated earlier, we were all about 20 at the time, so we were all hyped up because we knew that spooky time was getting close. We'd always pick on that other friend that tagged along. Nothing harsh, but just, you're scared. So I believe it was me that said something along those lines that was overheard by a few people. It got the attention of other people in the Wawa, including these two creepy, older guys who seemed like they didn't fit in. Their clothes were all beat up and dirty, and they just didn't seem right for the area, and the time was probably 8 p.m. on a Saturday night. "What's the little one scared of?" asked one of them. I say little because the three of us are all abnormally tall. The shortest between us was 6'4", and he was normal, so probably about 5'9". We replied and explained how we got tipped to go to this road, because it's haunted. They replied that it wasn't scary, and if we wanted a real scare, we should go to this random road. I forget what it was called exactly, but apparently it's this random memorial statue for a plane crash in the middle of the woods, where crazy things are supposed to happen. We grabbed our stuff, didn't think anything of it. As soon as we left, the group started talking and decided to go with the other road that the guys had hyped up. I know, a typical horror movie what not to do. So we get to the entrance of the road, and already it did not disappoint. There were woods on both sides, not one street light in sight. And I remember there was this, detention center off to the right, in the middle of nowhere. So the spooks already began from the moment that we hit the entrance. We decided to drive down the road and search for the statue. We noticed that there were trees cut down on the side of the road and laying parallel to the shoulder of it. We finally find the statue. About 5 minutes go by in silence, and we decided to enhance the scare factor by shutting the lights off. About a minute goes by and we see a shadow figure pop up from the statue. We all freak out as it starts walking toward us, but it was making movements that no human would normally be capable of. It was dark out, but this thing was black. It was darker than the woodsy sky, so we could make out some of it. It was huge. Like I said earlier, we were all extremely large compared to the average guy, but this thing would have dwarfed any of us. We decided to peel out of there and continue down the road, figuring that it would lead us out. Boy, were we wrong. About 3 minutes go by, and we hit a dead end, which in this case was an open spot in the woods with sand everywhere. The cutout was massive, but surrounded by forest. There were different cutouts, and ways to go from there, and I'm pretty sure the road continued after this cutout, but we were pretty deep in the woods by that point. So we decided to turn around and leave, obviously. After we turn around, we stopped to just take in the eerie feeling. The other three guys were talking about the shadow figure that we saw earlier, while I happened to catch something out of the corner of my eye. About 40 feet away from me, I see what appears to be a white face, and then another, and another, all surrounding the car. The other guys didn't see them, and I'm rarely ever scared, but seeing me panic, they all knew that something was up. My panic caused them to panic. We then floored it far away from the sand turnaround. We get about half a mile down the road, somewhat near the statue, and pull over to gather our composure before we get out of there. When we stopped, I swear I heard the most typical ghosty ooh kind of noise. This was now turning into a movie I wish that I was never part of. We were really scared. After finding the way that we had come, we started heading back out. Remember those trees I talked about earlier? They were now laying in the middle of the road, blocking us in, as we all see the white faces or masks that I had seen earlier. Thank God my one friend, the driver, was good at driving and valued safety over his car. We drove on the edge of the woods and felt like we were defying gravity to speed our way out. The car was literally sideways, on the edge of the forest. I mean, I could literally stick a single finger out the window and touch the trees. We all made it home safely that night. After doing research, we found out that that spot was notorious in that area for crazy things happening, such as body dumps and murders. Because of the shadow and the ghost noise that we heard, my head, heart, and gut tells me that that place is actually haunted. As previously stated, that place is famous for dumping bodies, along with the plane crash, so there's bound to be some spirits there. I think where we were that night was actually haunted, but we just happened to be there on a night when there were more things going on. I can't say for certain, but I'm 99% sure that we survived one of their setups that night. I'm 100% sure that I will never go back again. This isn't my story, rather that of my parents and two incredibly close family friends. Before I was born, the four of them used to hang out a lot. They would often drive out far into the Mojave Desert to party and drink around a fire, just have a good time in general. So they drove way out into the desert to have their friendly ritual. It was summertime and incredibly hot. Even late into the night, it still wouldn't have been cold. My mom, Stacy, and her friend Gina started getting scared about tarantulas at one point. They decided that they didn't want to camp out there after all. That's when all four of them began driving back. It was around 2 a.m. They were on a dirt road that went on for miles with no sign of civilization anywhere along the way. Suddenly, up ahead in the headlights, they saw what appeared to be a man in a long black trench coat, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. The collar of his coat was pulled up. He was walking along the side of the road in the same direction that they were driving. My dad had grown up hitchhiking a lot, and used to pick up hitchhikers as well, so my mom knew that he would probably consider stopping and talking to this guy to see if he needed a ride. But then, they all got a terrible feeling about him. My mom always told me that the way he was walking, the way he looked and dressed, and how he was in the middle of nowhere. Him and the whole scenario were emitting this really messed up energy that came off as horrifying and evil. Gina felt the same way. My dad starts joking, "Hey, let's pick this guy up." And my mom and Gina immediately started screaming and crying, begging him not to. They were in the back seat. My dad was driving, and their other friend Brad was in the front passenger seat. Gina even started punching my dad in the back, yelling at him not to stop. I guess my dad slowed way down as they passed, and they all turned to look at him as they went by. However, the moment the nose of the car actually passed him, he was gone. It was as if he disappeared into thin air. It wasn't as if there were rocks or trees for him to hide behind either. The weirdest thing of all is that I grew up hearing this story from my parents, but living very far away from their friends. When I was very young, we moved up north and they lost touch, even though whenever we would come back to California to visit, we would always get together with them, and it would be as if nothing had changed. I moved back here to California as an adult, and I work for Gina now. One of our first conversations when I came back was about the Hat Man. She brought it up, not me. And she told me word for word the exact same story that my parents had always told me. To be honest, I've always secretly feared yet been simultaneously intrigued by this entity because of hearing this story. Of course, now I've seen so many others online to compare it to that I am more fascinated than ever. On Labor Day of 2015, my mother, my wife, 3 children, and I went to a very remote cabin that we had rented out. It was an old fire watchman station or something of the sort, so it had the cabin and 3 other sheds and shops. I'll try to keep it short now, but this is a really bizarre story. We unpacked, settled into the cabin, and decided to take a walk a couple of 100 yards down to the river. We were all barefoot wearing sandals with shorts. We got down to the pebbled shore and were playing, throwing rocks, etc., when I realized that there were 1-foot snakes everywhere. My wife, mom, and I yanked up the 3 kids and boogied off. After reaching a safe distance, I went back with a water bottle and caught one of them to see what it was. It turns out we were in a nest of diamondback rattlesnakes. If one of those things had latched onto one of my kids, then surely they would have died. We were about 3 hours away from any medical facility. We got back to the cabin and my mom and I went for a hike alone while my wife calmed the kiddos and fed them lunch. Upon returning about 15 minutes later, all 3 of my wife and kids were inside with the doors and windows all closed, even though we had opened everything up to cool the place off. We went inside to hear all 4 of them start yelling about a bear that was about 150 yards from the cabin, huffing and puffing at the wife and kids on the front porch while they were eating. It was down by the river, another 30 yards or so down the hill. A few hours go by, and in that time, an ATV passed 3 times with 2 inbred-looking freaks on it, and each time they stopped in front of the gate onto the property and stared at us or the cabin. Keep in mind, again, we're hours into the wilderness in Idaho with no sight of a person the entire trip except for them. We decide it's bedtime for the kiddos, as it's pitch black out. Within 10 minutes, our son, who was 5 at the time, went from being perfectly fine, active, and talkative to having a fever of 103 degrees, slightly foaming at the mouth, and being completely unresponsive. That was it. We were leaving immediately and going to seek medical attention. I opened the front door of the cabin to start loading the 2 cars, and that's when we heard 3 adults and what sounded like 4 or 6 large, heavy animals running all around the cabin and property. There was one on the right side of the house, when exiting, that I could hear pacing back and forth, breathing heavily. I made everyone stay inside and close the door every time I went out to transfer stuff into the vehicles, which took me about 4 to 5 trips. I had a stick in a big pot that I was smacking as hard and loud as I could each time and was yelling loudly at random. As soon as I finished the loading, I took out each kid individually and loaded them into the cars. Then I escorted out my mom and then my wife. My wife and I were in the lead car, so we pulled up out of the gate, and for some stupid reason or other, I felt that I needed to close it. I got out of my vehicle and walked behind it, and my mom's car by about 15 feet, and closed the gate. Now, this gate is literally a log that slides from one post to the other. It offered 0 protection or barrier between me and the animals that sounded like they were out there. Right as I went to turn around, I heard loud padded footsteps walking up to me. Directly in front of me, no more than 10 feet, I see eyes shimmering from the moonlight as the deepest, scariest growl I have ever heard in my life rumbles through the air. I turned and ran so fast I swear that I must have jumped from where I was to the driver's seat of my car some 30 feet in front of me. As I landed in my seat, I slammed it into drive and spun out, finally leaving. It gets weirder and scarier, though. About 15 minutes down the road, we were still panicking about our unresponsive son. We both kept having this horrible, evil doom kind of feeling, like a shadow over us. I looked down and realized that I still had that baby rattlesnake in the water bottle in my cup holder, so I grabbed it and threw it out the window immediately. Not even 2 minutes later, we softly hear our son begin to cry. We realize that he's become responsive, and he stated something along the lines of, "Why are we leaving? What's going on?" He was crying because he was sad to leave. He couldn't even remember the last hour. The next day, my mom broke down extremely badly, sobbing her eyes out, and was hardly able to even speak. She confessed to my wife that the night before we left, she had a nightmare in which we went on the camping trip. We came across snakes, a bear, and a pack of wolves. She said that she knew a lot of bad things happened at that outpost, and that it was full of evil. Most of all, she said that one of our kids died. I swear on my life to this very day, if I ask her who died and how it happened, she immediately starts crying and refuses to tell me, or anyone else, anything more. She lives her life now with a guilt that she willingly ignored her premonition and put us in that situation, nearly taking the life of one of her dearest grandkids away. She doesn't deserve to feel like that. I know this all sounds insane, but a week later on the local news were reports of a wolf pack in that area. Wolves and bears may not coexist in harmony, but they do share territories and tend to respect each other. This outpost station of sorts was 1.5 hours into the wilderness from Loman Banks, Idaho, if you want to verify that these animals actually exist around there. I grew up in the mountains for most of my pre-early teen years, as did my wife until she was 10 years old. I even have a half a sleeve of the wilderness and trees on my left arm. With that said, we don't care to go to the mountains anymore. I'm married with 3 kids. The kids are older, 20, 17, and 10. We just bought a house and moved in the first week of December. Our room and my daughter's rooms are upstairs, and my 20-year-old son has a room in the basement. There's a storage room across from his room, then a big area with a fireplace where I have my gaming console, TV, and chair set up. Anyhow, on Christmas Day, the wife and kids were getting ready to go to her dad's house. I wasn't going because me and her dad didn't get along. I fire up the PlayStation in the basement and put on my headset. They're all upstairs running around because they're going to be late, and I see my son come downstairs and head into his room to grab something. A few minutes go by and I'm focusing on my game. Out of the corner of my eye, I see what I thought was my son leave his room and walk into the storage room, then slam the door hard and loud enough that I hear it through my noise-canceling headset. I pull off my headset and yell, "What the hell, man?" and look over at the storage room. The house is quiet. I walk over and open the storage room door. It's a 10 by 10 room with no windows and nothing in it. I look in his room, but he's not in there. I go upstairs, and they've already left. The van is gone. I told my wife about it, and she just laughed. Funny thing is, I never mentioned it to my son, but the other day I came home from work and he says, "Damn, Dad, I could hear you in the gaming room until like 4 a.m. I'm surprised you made it to work this morning." Me and all the girls had gone to bed by 9 p.m. the night before. This took place a few years ago. I was with my best friend and we decided to go camping at a campsite in Flagstaff named Lockett Meadow. We had taken our dogs. After a day of hiking and exploration, we played around a fire and eventually went to sleep. I awoke in the middle of the night to find this deep figure outside of our tent, burying itself into our tent. It had a weird way of hovering back and forth over my body, and my dog, who was curled up awake and not moving or making a sound, was at the bottom of my feet. I look over and see my best friend passed out, and his dog, which I'm unsure if it was awake, but clearly I was the only one between my friend and I that's experiencing this terrifying encounter. I eventually covered my head and thought about anything else that might make me fall asleep. The next day I asked my friend if he had somehow been awake through all of that. I explained what had happened. He replied no, and thought that I was just making it up. I told him maybe it was a bear, so we looked around our campsite, but couldn't find anything. No trails, no prints, nothing. We also had food out on a table near our tents, and a trash bag hung up on a broken branch, so even if it was a bear, I'm really surprised that it didn't get into any of our stuff. Either way, I remember how scared shitless I was, seeing this dark object observing our tent. Could it somehow have been the wind? A deer? Who knows? But this is just one encounter out of the whole trip. The next night, we decide to camp at Beaver Creek. Mind you, we're in Arizona. Before we wanted to settle in, we explored Sedona. We drove to Oak Creek and parked our car near a trail down by the water. We took our dogs and hiked to the creek. After we finished jumping in and swimming, we dried off and were about to head out. Next thing you know, in our peripheral vision, we see a giant rock being thrown near us. It makes a huge splash in the water. We look up and don't see anything above, so we ran over stones and rocks to get a clear view of the top, and still see no one. We yell out taunts and curse words, but still heard no one running off or any kind of sound in response. When we got to our next campsite at Beaver Creek and set up, my friend told me that throughout the trip since we started in Flagstaff, he had rocks being thrown at him, right up until that giant one at Oak Creek. We looked at each other and thought that maybe someone was following behind us, messing with us. Then we sort of laughed it off and said no, that was impossible, that we were just trying to connect the dots to have it be a cool look-back adventure. Well, I'm glad that it didn't turn into a part 3, because nothing happened that night, or the next day, where we packed up and headed home with nothing more than a memory that we wanted to rationalize. I grew up in the country in North Carolina. I lived up in the woods where there used to be a watermill. A family lived there back in the 40s. The parents had 2 daughters and 1 son. Unfortunately, one of the daughters got caught under the water wheel and drowned. Ever since I was a kid, I always heard humming and low singing in the woods when I was out tromping around. But one thing that really scared me one night is when I was older. I worked for the sheriff's office, and I had left work early one night due to being over on my hours. I got home around 2:30ish, and when I pulled up, I saw the figure of a little girl standing right beside my garage. When I got out of my car, she was gone. The next experience I had was when I was out hunting in the same woods. It was super quiet, a beautiful fall evening. I had just gotten down into my stand when all of a sudden I started hearing the same humming and singing I had heard multiple times over the years. But then I heard what sounded like someone walking toward me. I looked around everywhere and couldn't see anything. Then I heard a laugh, but not the same laugh as before. So as I was climbing down my tree stand, a rock hit my boot, and once again I heard the laughing. Now mind you, the area where I was hunting was about 3 miles deep in the woods, and there was no one around. I brought my brother and cousin and a few friends down there one night, and we were gonna just sit and listen and see if we could hear anything. We were down there playing cards, joking around, when all of us heard what sounded like someone in distress. We all got quiet and listened, and we could hear what sounded like someone breathing heavily. And the thing that confuses me about that night was if it was the little girl or something more dark. Sometimes I think things are better left alone. This is the only time I have ever had a threatening contact or experience. In June of 2019, me and a friend had decided to go with our girlfriends on a camping trip. It's the day of, and we're packing all of our things into the car. We finally get everything loaded and get into the car and put the address in the GPS. We set off, and after 3 hours of driving and 45 minutes of hearing my friend and his girl argue, we finally arrive. We get out of the car, and me and my friend begin to unload. After getting my stuff, I begin to gather my girlfriend's things. As I was, my friend was asking his girlfriend why she needed 3 bags for a one-night camping trip. She smiled and opened one of them, which contained an ounce of pot and other paraphernalia. The other 2 bags had her favorite snacks and clothes. Now knowing that we had weed, we had to find a place to camp that wasn't near any other people. It took until sundown, but we discovered the perfect spot. We decided that after we got everything taken care of, we would eat hot dogs and smoke. We started to build a campfire to light the area so that we could set up our tents, but ran out of wood immediately. I said that I would go get some while my friend stayed with the girls. I set off on my journey, and after about 2 minutes I find some sticks to use. I start picking them up, and all of a sudden I felt someone grab my wrist. I looked up to see a very pale, strange-looking man wearing a blank expression. For a man, he also had surprisingly long fingernails. He was digging them into my wrist while trying to grab my other wrist. I turned my head to not see his face and screamed for help, and my friends shouted a response, saying that they were coming. After they shouted, I immediately felt relief in my wrist. I wasn't struggling to keep my arms down, so I turned and ran as fast as I could, horrified. I met up with my friends and said that we had to leave immediately. I didn't even bother to explain myself. I just wanted gone. We loaded back up and took the long walk back. We get to the car and load our bags into it. I explained what happened as we were walking back, and it scared them enough to make them want to hustle. I had a picture of my wrist right after, but my iPhone broke and my cloud wasn't backed up, so I lost it. I do have a picture of it now, though. It has since then become a scar, which shows just how much force he was using. It was absolutely terrifying. In 2017, my girlfriend and I moved into a tiny, kinda crappy house in our college town. The house was made by a couple of students a few years prior, so the architecture was a bit sloppy. For example, the roof was flat. Take note of this because it'll be important later. However, the house was really cheap and close to campus, so it seemed like a total steal. The first couple months living there, nothing out of the ordinary happened, but it wasn't too long before we began experiencing strange paranormal activities. The first odd occurrence was with our smoke detectors. Our smoke detectors would go off constantly. It was strange because they would go off even if there wasn't smoke in the house from our bad cooking, for example. We thought that maybe it was because of old batteries, but no matter how many times we changed them, it never made a difference. It got to the point where they were going off 3 to 5 times a day, and at that, we just broke down and took the batteries out of them altogether. Note, there were 6 detectors in total. However, even without the batteries, the detectors were still going off. So out of desperation, we turned off the entire smoke detector circuit to the house. It was at this point when things started getting really out of control. The back room/storage room in the house always had a really eerie feeling, like someone was watching you or standing just behind you staring down at you. Thankfully, me and my girlfriend's bedroom was the furthest room in the house away from the storage area, so I avoided it like the plague. Anyways, one night around 3 a.m., the smoke detector in our bedroom goes off. However, it's not the usual repetitive beeping, it's a single, long beep. It sounded like when someone holds the test button on a detector. Frustrated, my girlfriend grabs a chair from the dining room and stands on it to reach the detector, but moments before she touches it, the beeping stops. We both groan in irritation as she goes to put the chair back. But before she makes it to the dining room, the detector down the hallway from our room makes the same continuous beep. Just like before, she stands on the chair to reach the detector, but right before grabbing it, it stops. Our smoke detectors continued this pattern all the way back to the creepy storage room. This happened 2 more times that night. It was as if whatever was messing with us was trying to lead us to its space. This would happen to us at least once or twice a week for the next 1.5 years that we lived there. Shortly after the encounters with the smoke detectors, the house became absolutely infested with bugs. There was no history of bug issues when we bought the home, and it started almost immediately after our first experience with the detectors. Bugs would pour out of light fixtures, small cracks in the walls, counters, and of course, the smoke detectors. Literally 1 minute everything would be fine, and then the next, winged insects or ants would pour out of the walls. We had multiple exterminators come, but less than a week after treating the house, the bugs would be back, just as bad as before. It made us miserable, and I've never seen an infestation to that extreme. It was absolutely unnatural. After these events, we began feeling really terrified and depressed. We both hated being home, but there was no other place for us to go. This was when the footsteps started. Remember how I said our roof was flat? At least a few times a week we would hear large, heavy, possibly hoof-like footsteps on the roof. We tried writing it off as being animals, so whenever we heard the steps we would run outside to see if we could spot whatever the animal was. But there was never anything there. The steps were very far apart from one another. Whatever was walking on our roof would start from the creepy storage room and in maybe 3 or 4 steps walk to our bedroom. The steps were so loud that it sounded like whatever was haunting us was either very big or stomping to get our attention. Now began the phantom sounds. We had large metal bowls that we used for daily cooking, so when we were done we would wash them and set them on the counter to dry. The first time it happened, me and my girlfriend were sitting on the couch in the living room. The kitchen was right next to the living room, but there was an island that blocked our view to the sink area. Anyways, on this night we were startled by the sound of our multiple metal bowls being thrown off of the counter. At this time we didn't have pets, so we assumed the worst and thought that someone might be breaking into the house. We both shot up and ran over to face our worst fear, but not only was no one in the house, nothing in the kitchen had been moved. The bowls were still on the counter, just where we left them. This was the most common paranormal occurrence in the house, and it happened at least 5 to 10 times a day at all hours. After a while, we were so sick and tired of these disturbances that we stopped using our metal bowls, or if we did use them, we would hand dry them and put them away right after use. This didn't make the spirit very happy, so next, we started hearing what sounded like our ceramic plates being thrown to the ground, and our kitchen cabinets slamming over and over again. Do you know those types of cabinet hinges that close slowly? Yeah, that's what we had. So, to slam the cabinets like that, they would have had to have been closed with excessive force. The next phase in our haunting was sightings and photographs. The phone I had at the time had one of those automatic face tracking features, meaning that when you would take pics on my phone, the yellow boxes would appear around the person's face to focus on them. One night I was taking a picture in me and my girlfriend's bedroom when a yellow face tracker square appeared at the foot of our bed, way above our bed. If that was a person, they would have had to have been at least 7 feet tall. At the time, we did have posters on our bedroom walls, so while focusing on the face tracker square, I circled the room to confirm that the tracker wasn't just focusing on one of them by accident. To my dismay, no matter where I was in the room, or from what angle, the square stayed in the exact same place. Oh yeah, even better, I was home alone for a few nights. I don't think I've ever experienced such sheer terror as I did when I went to sleep that night. After this first encounter, having cameras track faces in our pictures became a constant occurrence all throughout the house. The final phase of our haunting before getting the heck out of there was physical encounters. This happened more often to my girlfriend than me, but something would occasionally grab and pull our hair, especially when we were walking through the living room. But the most terrifying experience goes to our friend Jamie. She came to visit us for a few nights, and while she was there, she would sleep on our couch. She was aware of all the paranormal encounters in the house, and she had seen most of them firsthand, but nothing compared to what was about to happen. It was around 3 in the morning when she woke up with an eerie, uncomfortable feeling. All of a sudden, she experienced what felt like someone or something stepping up onto the couch. It stepped both of its feet up, one on either side of her body. Starting from her feet, it slowly walked up the length of her body until it felt like 2 feet were on either side of her head. She said she felt an intense, malevolent energy staring down at her, but she was too terrified to open her eyes. Meanwhile, the cabinets in the kitchen began to slam over and over. For the next few hours, she pretended to be asleep all the while this presence was standing over her. She told me she's not exactly sure when it went away, because she eventually became so exhausted that she did fall back asleep. Not too long after this experience, we were finally able to sell the house and get the heck out. We lost tons of money because we sold it for way less than we had originally paid. I can't help but feel bad for the person who bought the home, but it's been almost 3 years and she's still living there. I think the takeaway from this story is if a house is priced too good to be true, then it is. I recently went bush camping with my boyfriend on Crown Land near Stone Mills, Ontario. It was our first time doing bush camping, so I sent a video of our campsite set up to a friend. Days after this happened, I talked to my friend, who asked me about the ghost in the video that I was completely unaware of since I didn't take a second look at it after sending. When I had that closer look, I zoomed in to see a terrifying skeleton-like figure. At first, I thought it was a glare on the lens from the fire, but the figure is moving way quicker than the speed of the camera. This place was very deserted, but throughout the night, I heard clear footsteps that sounded human. So much so that I thought that the cops had come to kick us out when I saw a flashlight point at us from the woods. I quickly pointed my light back, but never saw any animals or people. I have been camping a lot and have had deer, squirrels, and raccoons come to my campsite, and their footsteps did not sound like the ones that I had heard. I'm not a believer of the paranormal or anything of the sort, so I didn't even think about it until watching the actual footage. This is a 100% true story that happened to me when I was about 12. I lived in a really small town in central Wisconsin with my family. My mom had gotten divorced when I was 8, but it was her and her boyfriend and all my siblings in the house, minus the 3 oldest. I had finally gotten my own room since the 3 oldest moved out, and was so excited, but for the first couple months I didn't sleep in there because I was too scared, so I would sleep with my sister in her room. As we were getting ready to move out of that house, I finally worked up the courage to sleep in my room by myself. My bed was positioned so that when I laid down on my back, I was facing the door. This night in particular, I had kept the bedroom door open because it was a really warm summer night. I remember waking up sometime in the night. I have no idea what time it was, nor do I think I would remember even if I had looked. Anyway, when I woke up, I turned over onto my back and happened to glance outside my door. When I did, I saw this black silhouette of a man who I thought looked just like Abraham Lincoln. Tall, thin, with what looked like a top hat and a beard. He was standing right outside my door next to the railing that led to the stairs. I remember staring for a moment, but getting freaked out and covering my head with the blanket and going back to sleep. Fast forward about a year to where we were moved into our new house, a small mobile home in the middle of nowhere, and I had a dream. In the dream, I was back in the old house, my childhood home. I remember all I could think was, I'm home. It felt so calm, so familiar. Everything was exactly how I remembered it, down to my messy room. In my dream, I went exploring through the house, reminiscing. I was so glad to be back, but then I woke up. It was such a nice dream, but I eventually forgot about it. And that was when I had my second dream. It was roughly a month or so later. I was back in my old home, but something was off. As I was walking through, I realized that things were missing. The china cabinet in the dining room was gone, and so was the stereo we had in the living room, and so on. Just little things. It didn't feel as familiar or as happy as the last dream that I had had, but when I woke up yet again, and just like the last time, I eventually forgot about it. Fast forward again to probably 2 or 3 months later, and I had another dream. I was back in my childhood home, surprise, surprise, and again things were missing and the whole energy just felt off. I remember feeling very uneasy and uncomfortable there, but I couldn't leave. And then I saw it again. The Abraham Lincoln-looking shadow that I had seen a year before. He was just wandering the halls upstairs. I got really freaked out and tried to leave, but then I woke up again. And again, I forgot about the dream not too long after. Finally, just a few short months later when I was staying at my grandparents' house, I had what would be the last dream. I was back in my old home again, and this time, everything was gone. The whole house was empty. It probably looked like that because that was how it looked the last time I saw it, right before we officially left. But anyway, I was walking through the house feeling so creeped out, and again like last time, just wanting to leave. It no longer felt like home. Then there was this man or figure. It didn't look like the shadow that I had seen before, but I couldn't make out any features either. He asked me if I was okay, and I said no, and that I wanted to leave. Then he asked, "Would you like to leave with me?" and held out his hand. I got such a bad feeling from him that I said no. He started promising me that if I went with him, that I could go back to my childhood home, back to what was so familiar and happy to me. But I refused, and then I woke up. After that, I told my sister everything. From the shadow man that I saw first, to all the dreams that I had. At first, we thought that maybe I was having some sort of psychic visions, but a few years later, I found out the truth. I found out that the silhouette that I saw was a shadow person after I watched a video by Haley Reese on what they are. Then a couple more years later, after meeting my boyfriend, whose whole family is very into the supernatural, I found out what the whole thing actually meant. He explained to me that demons often come to you in dreams to attempt to possess you. They'll start by creating a situation that's familiar and comforting, but after a dream or two, they start adding or taking things away, slowly, so as not to make it obvious. You start to become uncomfortable and threatened and scared, until one time they're the only thing that makes you feel safe, and that's when they have you. They'll promise you everything good you could ever want, and as soon as you say yes, you're saying yes to them taking over your body. My boyfriend explained that I was very smart for saying no, and for telling my sister. Because by telling my sister, I basically broke the demon's hold. That's apparently why back in the old days, people would tell their dreams to someone. Because it basically breaks the hold of whatever demon or spirit may be trying to possess you. I was 14 at the time this happened. I had just moved downstairs because I wanted more privacy, as my parents were always checking in on me. I've always been a rebellious kid and wanted to be alone and do my own thing, without anyone telling me not to. I had always noticed strange things happening around my house, and I kept asking my parents if they were going through my stuff in my room. They would always say no, so I always brushed it off. These things still happen to me to this day, like things being moved and waking up in a cold sweat, with no explanation. One night I was on my phone and I felt this feeling of dread and anxiety come over me. I then heard a voice say, "It's okay," and I looked up and a black silhouette of a woman was standing at the foot of my bed. She had no face, but I could clearly see the outline of a petite woman just standing there. I remember feeling very scared, but also very calm at the same time. I was looking at her for 15 seconds before she vanished. I told my parents what had happened, and they were also scared because my dad would always say that he felt a presence in the house. I instantly moved back up to the main floor. I remember telling people about it, and I would always remind them that my parents built the house, so there were no previous owners. People have given the idea that it was my grandma who passed away a year before this happened. I still question if this is true. I've not had anything that intense happen to me again. I still have the nightmares, and also question what she meant. Why was it okay? I remember telling that to myself over and over. I'm thinking of moving back down soon, but for now, I think I'm good. I went camping on a hiking trail in the Shawnee State Forest. During the day, I set up camp and went fishing in a creek running along next to the campsites. Most of the day, I felt fine and peaceful. I tend to feel at home in the woods alone and fly fishing. I started a fire, started on dinner over the fire before it got dark, and stoked the fire. Once it got dark, I felt compelled to keep the fire stoked, and a feeling of panic would set in if it even began to die down. I couldn't relax. I was constantly looking over my shoulder. It got to the point where I just grabbed my light and walked out, leaving all of my stuff there. I got out to the parking lot about 1.5 miles away and tried to steel my nerves and go back, but couldn't step past the tree line. I waited all the way until morning to go back to get my stuff, and the feeling was gone. I got everything together and left. Haven't been back since. I don't know if it was a ghost or a native spirit, since this place is deep in what used to be Shawnee tribe land. I used to work in a hotel as a security guard. It was built in 1922 and had a basement. One night, the front desk clerk, the valet, and I are just hanging out in the lobby just chatting when a phone rings. The phone call was coming from the basement where there are offices. At the time, there was supposed to be no one in there. I had already locked the doors and made sure that the basement was empty. The clerk picked up the phone, heard a weird noise, and then got disconnected. It chilled me to the bones. The valet guy and I went down to make sure that it was, in fact, empty and that no one had been trespassing. The doors were still locked, and I didn't see anyone coming out, so we went inside the office. The only thing that we found was the phone blinking, and it looked like someone had picked it up and dropped it. The valet and I looked at each other, and there was cold sweat on our faces. That is one of the creepiest things that has ever happened to me when working as graveyard security. My grandparents' house is haunted. Strange things happen all the time. We've gotten used to it over the years. I've seen people walking along the hallway. My mom has seen legs walk up the stairs. And my grandparents have both heard what they thought was me shout from the back of the house telling them that I was home, when I was 7 hours away in my own home. That's just a few of the things that have gone on. It's quite an active house to live in. My sister is only 13, and was doing what most kids her age do. She was dancing around the kitchen yesterday evening, making TikTok videos. The kitchen is down at the back of the house, and has a door with a window, which leads to the utility room. At night, the back room obviously gets dark, and the only light would have been from the kitchen. She said that she was twirling around when she saw a hand on the utility room side of the window, looking as if it were about to knock on the glass. This clearly scared her enough to ask Mom to investigate, but she found nothing that would have caused my sister to see what she had. Everyone else had been in the front end of the house watching TV, so we knew that it wasn't a family member playing a joke on her. It had happened to me years before, except it was a full person who had stood behind the door, and it happened in daylight. One final event to add more interest to the story: her school bag was on the kitchen counter last night when everyone went to sleep. This morning, we found it in the middle of the floor with all of her books stacked neatly right beside it. I spent the weekend camping throughout the Northeast, and all was very normal and quite nice. However, last night I camped in Massachusetts in a wooded area between Providence and Plymouth. Nothing felt negative, but I saw lights at least 3 times. The last time was just minutes ago, and that's what prompted me to write this. The lights are very quick, and almost out of the corner of my eye. I don't know what to say or quite how to describe it. I've never seen anything like it. And if it was paranormal, it was very clear. However, each time, they disappeared the second that I looked directly at them.